A 550-pound Chicago enforcer came to Harlem thinking size was power. He cornered the wrong girl, flashed the wrong weapon, and sent the wrong message all in one night. Bumpy Johnson heard every word. Then he made one phone call. What did Bumpy do that made a 550-pound man beg for mercy to understand how it all led here? We go back to where it truly began. The summer of 1961 did not arrive in New Jersey the way summers are supposed to arrive. It did not come gently, with warming breezes and lengthening days. It came like an uninvited guest who kicks the door off its hinges, walks straight to the liquor cabinet, and makes himself at home. It came heavy and absolute, pressing down on the pine trees of the barrens like a thumb on a bruise, wringing the moisture out of the air until every breath felt like drinking warm water through a cloth, at the edge of a fire road that no map bothered to name, in a clearing where the scrub pines grew close and conspiratorial. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. Purple first, then the sick gray of an old bruise, then a thin, watery orange that offered light but no warmth. The mist sat low along the ground, rolling between the tree trunks in slow, lazy coils, as if the earth itself was exhaling after a long and restless night. And from that earth, something was wrong. A head was protruding from the ground, not a skull, not a relic. A living human head, sitting at ground level as if the body beneath it had simply been swallowed whole by the sandy soil of the pine barrens. The face was broad, dark, and glistening with the cold sweat of a man who had been awake for too many hours and was no longer entirely certain of the difference between a nightmare and reality. The eyes were open but distant, fixed on the middle space between consciousness and oblivion. The lips were cracked and moving, forming words that no one was there to hear. The neck beneath the face disappeared into packed earth as neatly as a fence post cemented into concrete. There were no tire tracks nearby that a casual observer would have noticed. No footprints disturbed the pine needles in any obvious pattern. There was nothing to explain how a man of such extraordinary size had come to be planted in the ground like a tree that God had second thoughts about. There was only the head, and the mist, and the sound of something rustling in the brush 30 yards away. The head turned slightly to the left. The cracked lips formed one word, over and over, like a broken record that had forgotten every other groove. Bumpy, Bumpy, Bumpy. 72 hours before that head emerged from the earth of New Jersey, like the world's most unfortunate harvest. A different kind of morning was unfolding, 4 states away. The city of Chicago did not say goodbye to Tiny Mercer. Cities like Chicago do not waste sentiment on men like Tiny Mercer. The train station simply absorbed him and then released him. The way a large body of water accepts a thrown stone and closes over the ripple without ceremony. He boarded the eastbound with a single bag, a shoulder holster carrying a long-barreled .44 Magnum revolver, and a set of instructions from men whose names were spoken in whispers, even in rooms where no one was listening. His name was not actually Tiny. His name was Bernard Calvin Mercer, a name given by a mother in the South Side who had prayed over him in a hospital room and believed, genuinely and completely, that her son would one day be a minister. He was 5 years old when the neighborhood started calling him Tiny. And the irony was the specific kind that only suffering produces. By the time he was 19, he stood 6 feet and 7 inches tall. By the time he was 30, he weighed more than some motorcycles. The name stuck, not because people forgot what it meant, but because they remembered. And the reminder made them feel better about laughing when he was not in the room. He was a geological event wearing a suit. He was 550 pounds of pure Chicago intention, and every single ounce of it was pointed east toward New York, like a loaded weapon aimed at a target that did not yet know it had been selected. Tiny sat in his train seat, which had been specially arranged to accommodate him, and watched the landscape blur past the window. Indiana became Ohio. Ohio became Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania became the compressed electric chaos of the Jersey corridor. And then the tunnel swallowed the train, and he was in New York. He emerged from Penn Station into the August heat of Manhattan and stood on the sidewalk with his bag at his feet and looked at the buildings rising around him and felt nothing that resembled respect. He had been sent here to do a job. The job was simple, in the way that demolition is simple. You identify the structure. You apply pressure to the right points. You walk away from the rubble. The structure, in this case, was Harlem. The rubble, if everything went according to plan, would be the authority of one Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, while Tiny Mercer was riding northbound from Penn Station in a cab whose suspension was quietly suffering. The man he had been sent to displace was sitting in the living room of his apartment at Lenox Terrace, doing what he did every morning before the rest of the world decided what kind of day it was going to be. He was playing chess against himself. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not a large man in the physical sense. He was compact and precise. The way a fine watch is compact and precise. Every component exactly where it needed to be. Nothing wasted. Nothing decorative. He sat in a leather armchair that had taken on the shape of him over years of use. A chessboard on the table before him. A glass of cognac on the side table that he had been nursing for the better part of an hour. The apartment was cool, the air conditioner humming with quiet efficiency. A Miles Davis record turned on the phonograph in the corner, the trumpet notes filling the space not as music but as atmosphere, as climate. He studied the board with the expression of a man who is reading something written in a language that only he speaks fluently. His eyes moved from piece to piece, not with the anxious scanning of a player looking for opportunity, but with the slow, deliberate assessment of someone who already knows the outcome and is simply confirming the details. He had learned the game during his years at Alcatraz. He had played it every day since. He had not lost a match in 4 years, and not because he lacked worthy opponents. He lacked opponents who understood that chess was not a game about the board in front of you. It was a game about the board your opponent could not see. Bumpy Johnson was the king of Harlem, not because he had conquered it. He was the king because he understood it in a way that no outside force ever could or would. He understood that Harlem was not a territory. It was a relationship. Between the people who lived there and the streets they walked. Between the music that poured from the windows and the dignity that refused to be crushed, despite every effort the city made to do exactly that. He protected that relationship. He had bled for it, sacrificed for it, spent years behind federal walls for it. Every restaurant owner who never paid for protection, he could not afford. Every family who received a turkey at Thanksgiving that they could not have otherwise bought. Every child who walked safely to school through streets that should have been dangerous, these were not charity. These were the obligations of kingship. And Bumpy Johnson took his obligations seriously. He picked up his white knight. He considered the board. He set the piece back down without moving it. Whatever was coming, he would see it first. What was coming arrived 3 days after Tiny Mercer stepped off the train. Tiny was not subtle. Subtlety was a tool he did not own and would not have known how to use. He understood only one language, and that language was spoken not with words but with demonstrations. In Chicago, when you wanted to send a message to a powerful man, you did not write him a letter. You found someone he trusted, and you showed that person what you were capable of. And you made sure the powerful man received an accurate and vivid description of the demonstration by sundown. On a Tuesday afternoon, in a diner on 132nd Street called Mabel's, a man named Roosevelt Gaines was eating a late lunch. Roosevelt was a numbers runner, a middleman, a small but reliable gear in the machine that Bumpy Johnson had built and maintained across Harlem for 20 years. He was 52 years old, a grandfather, a man who wore the same brown hat every day and tipped every waitress as if they had saved his life. He was nobody's idea of a soldier. He was the infrastructure. He was the kind of man an organization needs 100 of to function, and loses the ability to function without. Tiny Mercer walked into Mabel's at 2:30 in the afternoon and sat down across from Roosevelt Gaines without being invited. The chair across the table groaned under the sudden imposition of weight. Roosevelt looked up from his plate of smothered chicken and cornbread and looked at the man across from him with the expression of someone who has opened a door expecting the mailman and found a weather event instead. "I know who you are," Tiny said. He did not bother with introductions. His voice was a bass frequency that traveled through the table and into Roosevelt's chest before it reached his ears. "And I know who you work for." Roosevelt said nothing. He set his fork down carefully, the way a man sets down something fragile when he realizes the room has become dangerous. "Chicago is coming in," Tiny said. He clasped his hands on the table. His knuckles were the size of walnuts. "Numbers, policy, the whole operation. Your boss is going to make room, whether he decides to or not. Question I'm asking you, right now, over this very nice plate of food, is whether you want to be standing on the right side of that arrangement when it happens." Roosevelt Gaines looked at the hands on the table. He looked at the face above them. He looked toward the window of the diner, where he could see the street outside, the familiar rhythm of Harlem moving past in its ordinary afternoon patterns. He thought about his grandchildren. He thought about the man whose name he had served under for 15 years without a single moment of doubt about where his loyalty resided. "I appreciate the offer," Roosevelt said quietly, "but I'm going to have to decline." What happened next took 4 seconds. Tiny reached across the table, took Roosevelt's right wrist in one hand, and applied pressure. Not violence. Pressure. The distinction matters. There was no dramatic gesture, no raised voice, just the mechanical, dispassionate application of force, the way you might test the structural integrity of something before deciding whether it is worth keeping. Roosevelt made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry. The fork clattered to the floor. 2 other customers in the diner looked up and then looked away with the practiced, survival-tested speed of people who understand that what they are seeing is not their business. Tiny released the wrist. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. "Tell your boss I said hello," Tiny said. He dropped a single bill on the table, not enough for the meal, and walked out into the afternoon sun. He had chosen that diner specifically. He had chosen that time specifically. He had chosen Roosevelt Gaines specifically, because he knew, with the cold calculation of a man who had done this before in other cities, that 2 of Bumpy Johnson's people ate at the counter of Mabel's diner every single afternoon. He had watched the place for 2 days before walking in. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the report to be detailed and accurate and delivered fast. He wanted Bumpy Johnson to be afraid. The report reached Lenox Terrace before the dinner hour. Bumpy was in his study when the knock came at the door. The study was a room that told you everything about the man who inhabited it if you knew how to read rooms. There were books on every wall, philosophy, history, poetry, biography. There was a desk that was clear of clutter, every paper in its place, every pen returned to its holder. On the corner of the desk sat a small bronze chess piece, a king that he had carried out of Alcatraz as a reminder of something he never discussed with anyone. The man who entered was named Calvin Webb, young, reliable, and currently the color of someone who has been asked to deliver news he would rather not deliver. He stood in the doorway and held his hat in his hands and looked at Bumpy Johnson the way a man looks at a body of deep water he has been asked to cross. Bumpy was sitting at the desk. He did not look up immediately. He was reading. He finished the paragraph he was on, turned down the corner of the page with the precise fold of a man who respects the object in his hands, and then looked up. "Sit down." "Calvin," he said. Calvin sat. He told the story. He told it accurately and in order. The way Bumpy had trained every one of his people to report facts first, interpretation second, emotion. Never, he described Tiny Mercer. He described what happened to Roosevelt Gaines. He described the specific words that had been spoken and the specific manner in which they had been delivered. He described the way Tiny had walked out of the diner without hurrying, without looking back, without any of the behavioral markers of a man who fears consequence. When Calvin finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long moment. Bumpy did not ask about the numbers. He did not ask about which routes were at risk or which lieutenants needed to be contacted or what the financial exposure looked like if Chicago made a serious push into Harlem's operation. These were questions any other man in his position would have asked first. Bumpy asked none of them. He asked one question. His voice was level and soft, the voice of a man conducting an inquiry rather than a man experiencing an emotion. "Does he know my daughter's name?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Calvin Webb felt the ripple move through him before he understood why. He opened his mouth. He closed it. The pause before his answer was the answer itself, and both men in the room understood this simultaneously. Bumpy Johnson looked at Calvin Webb for 3 full seconds. Then he looked away, toward the window, toward the lights of Harlem that were beginning to appear in the early evening. His jaw was set. His expression had not changed in any visible way that a casual observer would have catalogued as anger or alarm. But something had shifted behind his eyes. Something that had been held in careful reserve had been quietly, permanently unlocked. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head, the way a judge nods when the last piece of testimony confirms what he already knew. "Thank you, Calvin," Bumpy said. "Go home. Kiss your family tonight." Calvin stood, replaced his hat, and left the room without another word. He had worked for Bumpy Johnson for 6 years. He had been in that study during difficult conversations before. But he had never left it feeling quite the specific combination of things he felt as he rode the elevator down to the street that evening, relieved to be out of the room. And deeply, instinctively grateful that he was not the man that conversation had been about. Behind the closed door of the study, Bumpy Johnson sat completely still, on the chessboard in the living room. The game he had been playing against himself that morning was still in progress. The White King stood in the center of the board, surrounded by his pieces, waiting. Bumpy had not yet decided the ending. He always decided the ending before he moved. He was deciding now. What no one in Chicago understood, what Tiny Mercer, with all his mass and menace and borrowed confidence, could not possibly have understood, was that threatening Bumpy Johnson's territory was a negotiation. Threatening Bumpy Johnson's people was an escalation. But walking into Harlem and letting it be known that you were aware a young woman named Elise Johnson existed, and that her existence could be made relevant to your purposes, that was not a negotiation. That was not even a war. That was an ending. And Tiny Mercer, celebrating in some basement card room, buying rounds for men who were already calculating how to be somewhere else when the consequences arrived, had no idea that he had just made the last meaningful choice of his current life. He thought he had sent a message to the King of Harlem. He had. But the message the king received was not the one Tiny intended to send, and before another sun set over the pine barrens of New Jersey, Tiny Mercer would understand, in the most visceral and unambiguous terms available to human experience, the precise difference between the two. The Apollo Theater on a Friday night was not merely a building, it was a declaration. It was Harlem standing up straight and saying, without apology and without qualification, that beauty belonged here as much as it belonged anywhere else on earth. Perhaps more. The marquee blazed with the kind of golden light that made the whole block feel chosen, and the crowd that gathered beneath it wore that feeling openly in the silk of a woman's dress, in the sharp crease of a man's trousers, in the laughter that came easy and rang clear above the noise of the street. Elise Johnson moved through this crowd the way she moved through most things in her life, with the quiet, unhurried confidence of a woman who had been taught, by blood and by circumstance, that composure was not a performance, it was armor. She was 20 years old, and she wore both her age and her name with equal grace. She had her father's eyes, those still, observant, slightly dangerous eyes that processed a room the way a chess player processes a board, not looking for what was there, but for what was missing, what was wrong, what did not fit. She had her mother's posture, that particular straightness of spine that communicated dignity without requiring a single word to support it. She was waiting near the ticket booth for two friends who were running late, checking her watch with the mild impatience of someone who genuinely expected better. The music drifting from the lobby was doing what music at the Apollo always did. It was making the sidewalk feel like the interior of something sacred, like standing in the anteroom of a church where the sermon was pure and the congregation was alive. She did not notice the crowd shift at first. It happened the way barometric pressure changes happen, not with drama, but with the body's slow, wordless recognition that the atmosphere has altered. The laughter near the curb softened. A group of young men who had been occupying a lamppost with the comfortable authority of regulars suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. The space around her, which had been full and warm and easy, became something different, became watched. She looked up. Tiny Mercer was standing 6 feet away, and the distance was already closing. Up close, in the golden neon light of 125th Street, he was a different category of human being entirely. He was not large the way a large man is large. He was large the way a structural element is large, a load-bearing wall, a pylon, something the architecture depends on and cannot do without. His shadow fell over her before he had finished his approach, and for one involuntary half-second, the lizard part of her brain, the ancient part that has nothing to do with dignity or composure or the armor her father had helped her build, sent up a pure white flare of alarm. She did not let it reach her face. "You're the girl," Tiny said. He stated it the way men like him stated most things, not as an observation, but as a claim of ownership over the fact. His voice moved through the air like a slow vehicle, heavy and without urgency. "The princess. I don't know you," Elise said. Her voice was steady, not performatively steady, not the false calm of someone suppressing panic, but the real, grounded steadiness of a woman who had grown up understanding that showing fear to the wrong person was the most dangerous thing you could do. "And I'd like you to step aside. I don't think I'll be doing that," Tiny said. He placed one massive hand against the wall of the theater, just above and to the left of her shoulder. The brick did not shift. Neither did she. "I'm a business associate of your father's. Come to deliver a message. You might say, professional courtesy. My father's associates don't introduce themselves this way," Elise said. Tiny smiled. It was not a smile that had anything to do with warmth. It was the expression of a man who has confused the ability to frighten people with the possession of actual power. "Different kind of associate," he said. "New arrangement. Chicago style." He leaned in slightly, letting his shadow deepen over her. "Your daddy built something real nice up here. Real comfortable. Chicago thinks it's time for a change of management. And I'm the change." Elise looked at him with an expression that was not fear and was not anger, and was not the wide-eyed paralysis he was accustomed to producing in people. It was something quieter and more disturbing than any of those things. It was assessment. You've done this before, she said. In other cities. Walked in somewhere that wasn't yours. Made yourself large. Waited for people to move. Something flickered in Tiny's eyes. He had not expected that sentence. Smart girl, he said, and the way he said it made the compliment into something else entirely. They always moved, Elise continued, as if he had not spoken. And you walked away thinking it was because of you, because of your size, your reputation, that thing under your jacket. Her eyes dropped briefly, precisely, to the line of the holster visible beneath his open coat, then back up to his face. You want to show me something? It was not a question. Tiny registered this, and it displeased him in a way he could not entirely name. So he did what men of his particular construction always do when they encounter something they cannot categorize. He converted it to theater. Slowly, with the deliberate showmanship of a man who has practiced this gesture. He drew back the left lapel of his jacket. The .44 Magnum sat in its holster against the stained white fabric of his shirt, dark and heavy and absolute. Accidents happen, Tiny said softly. You tell your daddy that. You tell him the streets are unpredictable. You tell him that pretty things left unprotected have a way of getting damaged. He let the lapel fall back. Tell him the rent is overdue. The crowd around them had created a perimeter of careful inattention, people nearby who were looking everywhere except at this specific piece of sidewalk, performing the elaborate choreography of urban survival. No one was coming. No one was going to come. They all knew whose daughter she was, and they also knew what they were looking at, and the calculation was not a complicated one. Elise looked at the hand against the wall above her shoulder. She looked at the face. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than most people managed. I'll tell him, she said. And then, with a composure that she would later admit to, no one had cost her everything she had, she said. But understand something. You just chose your own ending. You don't know it yet. But you did. Tiny laughed. The sound bounced off the marquee above them. He stepped back, opening the space between them like a man releasing something he was finished with. Run along, princess, he said. Give the king my regards. She walked. She did not run. She moved through the crowd that parted for her with lowered eyes and guilty silence. And she kept walking for 3 blocks until she found a cab. And only when the door was locked and the lights of 125th were receding in the rear window did she allow her hands, folded in her lap, to tremble. The apartment at Lenox Terrace was quiet when she came through the door. The record in the living room had finished, and the needle was riding the end of the vinyl in a soft, repetitive whisper. Bumpy was in the leather armchair, a book open in his lap, his reading glasses low on his nose. He looked up when she entered, and in the half-second before she had arranged herself, he saw everything. He closed the book. He set it on the table with the care of a man who is deciding to be very still. Come sit down, he said. She told him. She told him with the accuracy and the order he had always, without ever explicitly saying so, modeled for her the facts first, the sequence, the words as close to verbatim as memory allowed. My Johnson appeared in the doorway from the kitchen at some point during the telling, and stood with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between her daughter's face and her husband's, reading both the way she had learned to read them over decades of a life that required this particular fluency. When Elise finished, the room held the story for a moment, the way a room holds the last note of a piece of music, not with silence, but with the vibration of what has just been expressed. Bumpy stood. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and he looked out at his city. at the lights of Harlem laid out below him like a map of everything he had ever sworn to protect. 1 minute passed, perhaps longer. Mai did not speak. Elise did not speak. The city below made its ordinary sounds, indifferent and continuous. When Bumpy turned around, his face was the same face it had always been. That was the thing that was most difficult to describe to people who had not witnessed it, the absence of the visible transformation. There was no reddening, no clenched jaw, no raised voice. He looked like a man who had just confirmed a calculation he had already been running. He looked, in fact, like he always looked, but his eyes were different. Something behind them had gone very, very quiet, in the specific way that certain things go quiet right before they become permanent. He crossed the room to the telephone on the side table. He lifted the receiver. He dialed a number he had not written down anywhere, because some numbers you carry in the bone. He waited through 2 rings. "Junie," he said. 1 word, and the way he said it communicated an entire paragraph. "Yeah, boss," came the voice on the other end, raspy, economical, awake despite the hour. "Get the car," Bumpy said. "Bring the boys." A pause, measured and deliberate. "And bring the shovels." He set the receiver back in its cradle. He did not look at his wife or his daughter. He went to the bedroom and changed into a dark suit with a white shirt and a dark tie and his good hat. And he checked his reflection in the mirror with the brief, functional attention of a man confirming that everything is in order before a meeting. Which, in a sense, he was in the business of consequences. Tonight, the books needed balancing. Junie Bird had been Bumpy Johnson's shadow for 11 years. And in those 11 years he had learned one thing above all others about the man he served. Bumpy Johnson did not move fast. He moved right. There was a distinction, and the distinction was everything. Fast men made errors. Fast men left loose ends and created complications, and woke up one morning to discover that their haste had assembled, brick by brick, the architecture of their own undoing. Bumpy moved at the speed of certainty, which was sometimes slow and sometimes swift, and was always exactly as fast as the situation required, and no faster. Tonight, the situation required precision. The basement card room on 138th Street was the kind of place that existed in Harlem, the way certain organisms exist in nature, by being exactly what it needed to be for the people who needed it, and completely invisible to everyone else. The entrance was through the back of a shoe repair shop. The stairs were steep and the ceiling was low, and the single bulb that hung above the table cast the faces of the players in the sharp relief of a painting where nobody was entirely innocent. Tiny Mercer occupied most of one wall. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and his arms on the table looked like something a sculptor had produced to make a point about excess. He was drunk on bourbon and on his own performance from earlier in the evening, and he was celebrating with the specific generosity of a man who is spending confidence he has not yet earned. He had bought 2 rounds for the table. He was telling a story for the 3rd time, and the men around him were laughing with the careful enthusiasm of people who understand that their options are limited. "You should have seen her face," Tiny was saying, his voice filling the room the way his body filled the chair. "Little princess, standing there outside the Apollo, looking at me like I dropped out of the sky." He drained his glass and set it down with a satisfaction that shook the table. "That's how you send a message. You don't go to the man. You go to what the man loves. You make him feel it." One of the players, a thin man with a careful face, looked at his cards and said nothing. Another studied the wall above Tiny's head with great intensity. They all knew what Tiny apparently did not, that in this neighborhood, in this city, under the particular jurisdiction of the man whose daughter had been cornered outside the Apollo Theater 2 hours ago. There was no such thing as a message that went unanswered. There was only the interval between sending and receiving. That interval was ending. The door at the top of the stairs opened, and a man came down. He was not remarkable to look at. He was perhaps 5 feet and 7 inches, lean, wearing a plain windbreaker and a flat cap, his hands in his pockets, his walk the relaxed, unhurried walk of someone who arrives, places already knowing what he will find. He paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked around the room with the mild, cataloging attention of a man taking inventory. His eyes settled on Tiny Mercer, and stayed there. "You Tiny Mercer?" Junie Bird asked. His voice was dry and flat and entirely without drama, which was itself a kind of drama. Tiny looked at him across the table with the bleary, contemptuous amusement of a large animal regarding something it considers beneath classification. "Yeah, that's me," he said. "Who are you supposed to be?" "Message from the landlord," Junie said. The lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming out. Completely and instantly. As red cut the line at the fuse box in the alley, and the room was plunged into a darkness so total it had texture. The reaction was immediate and operatic. Chairs ground back against the concrete. Glass broke. Men swore and stumbled and moved toward what they hoped were walls. Someone knocked the table and the chips and cards cascaded to the floor in a long, clattering rush. Tiny roared. He stood, and the standing itself was a violent act. The table went one way and a chair went another, and his arms swung out into the dark like a man trying to take the room apart with his bare hands. "Come on then," he bellowed, his voice ringing off the low ceiling. "Come on, all of you. I'll put every one of you through the wall." He swung left. He swung right. His fists moved through the empty dark with the force of things that had ended other evenings in other cities. But they found nothing, because Junie Bird was not standing where Tiny expected him to be. Junie Bird was standing exactly where the physics of the room and the geometry of Tiny's position and 11 years of doing this kind of work had told him to stand. He did not go for the head. The head was a fortress wall, thick and proud, and built to absorb impact. He went for the side of the neck, the carotid, the expressway of blood to the brain, the place where the body's confidence in its own continuity was most vulnerable. The leather-wrapped instrument in his hand made a single, precise sound in the dark, a wet, compressed crack. And then there was a different kind of sound entirely, the sound of something enormous losing its argument with gravity. Tiny Mercer fell the way buildings fall when the engineers have done their work correctly, straight down, in sections. The knees first, then the torso, then the full mass arriving at the concrete floor with a concussion that sent a visible tremor through the playing cards still settling around him. The bare bulb swung back on and the room snapped back into harsh, unforgiving light. The other players were pressed against the walls with the specific posture of people who have decided that whatever is happening in the center of the room is not their story. Junie stood over the unconscious mountain of Tiny Mercer and adjusted his cap with 2 fingers, the way a man adjusts his cap after a walk in mild wind. "Game's over," Junie said, addressing the room generally. "Go home to your families." They went. They did not require further encouragement. They drove 2 hours through the night, the Lincoln moving through the tunnels and across the bridge and out into the dark flatness of the Jersey corridor. The panel van following behind, carrying its extraordinary cargo. The Pine Barrens swallowed the headlights as they turned off the highway onto the fire road, the scrub pines pressing close, the sandy ground muffling the tires. When they reached the clearing, they stopped. The headlights of the Lincoln cut 2 bright columns through the mist and showed them the ground, soft and dark and willing. The shovels made clean sounds in the earth. When Tiny Mercer began to groan his way back to consciousness, he found himself vertical. This was the first piece of information his returning mind received, and it did not parse correctly against anything else the rest of his body was reporting. He could not move his arms. He could not move his legs. He could not, with any amount of effort, shift his weight in any direction at all. He was embedded. The earth held him with the indifferent, mechanical completeness of concrete, packed tight around every curve and plane of his body, from his feet to his shoulders. And above the dark line of the soil, there was the mist, and the pine trees, and the twin columns of headlight, and a man sitting on a flat stump less than 5 yards away, lighting a cigar with a gold lighter. Bumpy Johnson looked exactly as he had looked when he left his apartment. The dark suit, the white shirt, the good hat, not a crease disturbed. The gold lighter clicked shut, and the ember of the cigar glowed orange in the dark and illuminated his face in a way that was precise and unhurried and entirely without mercy. "Mr. Mercer," Bumpy said. His voice was conversational. This was somehow worse than any other tone he might have chosen. Bumpy. The name came out of Tiny's throat in a shape that bore no resemblance to the name as he had used it earlier in the evening, when he had said it with the sneering confidence of a man invoking a diminished thing. Now it was just a sound that meant I understand that I have made an error of a type I cannot yet fully measure. "You're uncomfortable," Bumpy observed. He studied the end of the cigar with the mild interest of a man checking his watch. "That's appropriate. Comfort is earned." He settled back on the stump, crossing one leg over the other, and looked at Tiny with the patient attention of a man who has set aside the entire evening for this conversation and intends to use every minute of it. "Whatever you want," Tiny said. The earth was pressing his diaphragm from all sides, and his breath came in shallow, effortful sips. "Money, territory, whatever number you need. I can get it. My people in Chicago, they'll pay. Just say the number." "There's no number," Bumpy said quietly. "Then what?" Tiny's voice cracked at the edges. The bourbon confidence was entirely gone, burned off by the cold of the ground and the reality of his position. And what was left underneath was something that Tiny Mercer had not shown anyone since he was 7 years old, and his size had not yet become a substitute for everything else. "What do you want from me?" Bumpy took a long, slow drag of the cigar and let the smoke out in a thin, deliberate stream that dissolved in the mist above their heads. "When I was in Alcatraz," he began, with the measured ease of a man beginning a story at a dinner table, "there was a guard whose name was Miller. He was a large man, not your scale, but large enough to believe that his size was the most important thing about him." He paused. "Men like that always believe that. It's the first mistake they make, and it tends to be the last one." Tiny said nothing. The earth held him. He listened because there was nothing else to do. "Miller enjoyed his authority," Bumpy continued. "He enjoyed it the way small men enjoy borrowed power loudly, and at the expense of whoever was nearest. He took my books. You understand, I was reading philosophy, history, poetry. I had built, inside those walls, inside that cage, a life of the mind that no cell could contain. And Miller would come and tear the pages out, one by one. Laughing, he'd say, 'What are you going to do, Johnson? You're locked up. You're nothing.'" Bumpy looked at the cigar. He thought the bars were keeping me in. He hadn't understood that they were keeping him out. "What did you do to him?" Tiny asked, and his voice had changed again, not to bravado, not to plea, but to something genuine, compelled. The voice of a man who was actually listening despite everything. "I waited 6 months, Bumpy said. "I learned his patterns, his rhythms, his habits. the specific geography of his confidence, and one afternoon in the laundry room, when the steam was thick enough that the room had no edges, Miller fell. He slipped, and I was there, standing over him, and I looked him in the eye, and I quoted Nietzsche. He tilted his head slightly. When you stare into the abyss stares back into you. A pause. Miller screamed, not because I touched him, because he realized, lying on that floor, that his power had always been an arrangement, a story everyone had agreed to tell, and that I had simply stopped agreeing. Bumpy stood. The movement was unhurried, the standing of a man who has finished a meal and found it satisfactory. He resigned the next week, moved to Ohio, became a farmer. The cigar ember traced a small arc in the dark as Bumpy turned it in his fingers. You came into my city, he said, and his voice had dropped now to something very quiet, very direct, carrying across the 5 yards between them without effort. You came into my home and you found a girl, a young woman who has never raised a hand against anyone, who has nothing to do with whatever business your employers imagined they had with me. And you used her. You used her terror as a tool. You made her feel small and helpless and afraid on a public sidewalk, in front of the theater she loves, in the neighborhood that is her home. He looked at Tiny with an expression that was not anger and was not cruelty, which made it somehow more final than either. You wanted to show her what power looks like, so I brought you out here to show you the same thing. He gestured at the clearing, at the mist, and the trees, and the packed earth, and the vast, indifferent dark of the barren stretching in every direction, without boundary or mercy. This, Bumpy said softly, is what helpless feels like. Not the drama of it, not the performance. The actual thing, the weight of it, the silence. He crushed the cigar out against the side of the stump. The last light in the clearing died. I don't want to destroy you, Mr. Mercer. I want you to become part of this ground for a while. I want you to think about Elise. I want you to lie here in the dark and understand, in a way that no conversation, and no threat, and no demonstration of force could ever teach you, what it means to be truly small. Tiny's breathing had become audible, rapid, the compressed and panicked breathing of a man whose body is arguing with the amount of air available to it. Bumpy, don't leave me here, please. I am asking you. I am begging you. Goodbye, Mr. Mercer, Bumpy said from the dark. Footsteps, soft on pine needles, moving away. The sound of brush displaced by a careful passage, then the distant, muffled sound of a car door, and an engine turning over, and tires on gravel, growing smaller and smaller until the sound was indistinguishable from the wind moving through the trees. And then there was nothing at all, nothing except the earth, and the dark, and the slow, terrible weight of both. What no one in that clearing knew what Tiny, packed into the ground and shaking, could not possibly have known was that Bumpy Johnson had made one additional telephone call before leaving Harlem that evening. A call to a number that rang in a dispatch office 40 minutes away. Anonymous. Brief. Specific about the location. The fire road. The clearing. The call of a man who understood that the lesson he intended to teach required a student who survived to carry it forward. He did not want Tiny Mercer's end. He wanted something far more difficult to arrange, and far more lasting. He wanted his transformation, and that the mercy inside the punishment, the calculation inside the cruelty. The architect's precision applied not to destruction, but to consequence. That was the move that no one saw coming. Not even the men who drove the car. They found him just after dawn. 2 park rangers working the early shift. responding to an anonymous tip called into the dispatch office the previous evening, a calm, precise voice that gave the fire road, the clearing, the approximate distance from the main access point, and nothing else. No name, no explanation, just the coordinates of a man who needed to be found. When the first ranger's flashlight swept across the clearing and landed on a human head protruding from the earth at ground level, he stopped walking entirely for 3 full seconds. His partner, Frank, came up behind him and followed the beam of light and said something that was not a word. They ran. They dropped to their knees in the sandy soil and began digging with their hands, calling to him, asking if he could hear them, telling him to hold on, that help was here, that everything was going to be all right. It took a truck with a winch and most of an hour to undo what had taken far less time to arrange. When they finally pulled Tiny Mercer free of the earth, he could not stand. His legs had forgotten their purpose entirely. The circulation cut off long enough that the nerve endings were conducting a slow, painful renegotiation with the rest of his body. He collapsed onto the ground and lay there on his back in the thin morning light, staring up at the sky with the expression of a man who has revised every opinion he has ever held about what matters and what does not. He was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Who did this to you?" the first ranger asked, kneeling beside him, a blanket already around his shoulders. "Can you tell us who's responsible?" Tiny looked up at the sky. He looked at the pine trees standing at the edge of the clearing, still and patient and indifferent. He looked at the ground that had held him, the same ground that had given him back. And he understood with the clarity that only genuine suffering produces, that both of those things had been decisions made by the same man. He had been buried by choice. He had been found by choice. He was alive by choice. And the distance between those choices was a message written in a language he could finally, completely read. The name was right there. It sat on the back of his tongue like a stone. He thought of the eyes above the cigar ember. He thought of the story about the guard who had moved to Ohio and become a farmer. And he understood for the first time that the story had not been a threat. It had been a map showing him exactly where he was standing, exactly what kind of man he had become, and exactly what would be required if he intended to become something different. "I don't know," Tiny said. His voice was barely a voice. It was dark. They wore masks. I didn't see anything. He closed his eyes. "I just want to go home. I just want to go back to Chicago." The ranger looked at him for a long, skeptical moment. Then he looked at his partner, then back at Tiny. He had been doing this work long enough to understand that some truths are made, not found, and that the man lying in front of him had made a choice just now that was going to define the rest of his life in ways the man himself was only beginning to comprehend. "All right," the ranger said quietly. "Let's get you out of here." 300 miles to the north, in the back room of the Flash Inn on 7th Avenue, the evening dinner service was producing its usual results. The table was laden and the conversation was easy, and Bumpy Johnson was eating with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who has no outstanding business with the world. When the young runner appeared in the doorway and leaned down to murmur in his ear, Bumpy simply nodded and told him to send them in. The 2 men from Chicago looked exactly like what they were. They stood at the entrance to the back room in their wide-shouldered suits and their flat, cold faces, and looked at Bumpy Johnson eating his dinner, and whatever they had expected to find. This was not it. He gestured at the empty chairs across the table with the mild hospitality of a man who genuinely cannot imagine why anyone would remain standing when there are chairs available. They sat. "Mr. Johnson," the lead one said, "we're looking for our associate, Bernard Mercer. He checked into the Teresa Hotel 4 days ago, and we've had no contact since. Bumpy cut a piece from his plate with the precise, unhurried attention of a man who considers the food in front of him worth the consideration it deserves. He chewed. He set his fork down. He looked at the man across from him with an expression of polite, faintly puzzled helpfulness. "Your friend found what he was looking for," Bumpy said. "A quiet place, some perspective." He lifted his glass. "I believe he's decided to head home. I don't think he'll be coming back to New York." He let a small pause settle over the table like a white cloth. Harlem wasn't quite the right fit for him. The man from Chicago held Bumpy's gaze and performed the only honest piece of work he would do that evening, which was to read what was actually in front of him. He saw a man who was finished with a conversation before it had officially begun. He saw the absolute, unperturbed confidence of someone who holds every card in the deck and has already decided that no hand is worth playing. He did the only mathematics that remained available to him. "I see," he said. He stood. His partner stood. "Sorry to interrupt your evening, Mr. Johnson." "Not at all," Bumpy said. "Enjoy the city while you're here. The food is worth the trip." They left. They did not look at each other until they were on the sidewalk, and then they did not need to speak because the conversation was already over. They went back to their hotel. They packed. They were on the first train west in the morning, and the report they carried back to Chicago was simple and final. Harlem was not available. The man who held it was not a gangster in any category they had encountered before. He was something that did not have a clean name. And things without clean names were, in their experience, the most permanent things of all. The flowers arrived at the Apollo Theater on a Thursday morning. The arrangement was extraordinary white lilies and orchids, tall and architectural and quietly extravagant. The kind of thing that made people stop on the sidewalk and look. The card attached said only, "To the Apollo." And to Harlem, "Keep the lights on. A friend." No name. No address. The theater manager accepted the delivery with genuine puzzlement and placed the arrangement in the lobby where everyone passing through could see it. Elise was walking past that afternoon with two friends, deep in the middle of an entirely different conversation, when she stopped. She stopped the way you stop when something in your peripheral vision resolves into something that requires your full attention. She looked at the flowers in the lobby window. She looked at the white of the lilies, clean and deliberate and somehow restoring. She did not know who had sent them. She would never be told. But she felt the intention behind them the way you feel the warmth of a room before you've fully entered it. And something that had been sitting in the back of her chest since the night outside this very building quietly released its hold and let go. She walked home to Lenox Terrace. She came through the door and found her father in the living room, exactly where he was most himself at the chess table. The board in its late-game configuration. The cognac at his elbow. Miles Davis turning softly in the corner. She crossed the room and kissed him on the cheek. And he reached up briefly and pressed her hand. "How was your day?" he asked, studying the board. "Good," she said. "Really good." He nodded. He reached out and picked up the queen, the most powerful piece on the board, the one that moves without restriction, that covers the whole geography of the game. He set her down in the only square that mattered. A quiet sound. Wood on wood, final and clean. "Checkmate," he said softly. He looked up at his daughter, and for the first time in many days, in the way that a man permits himself a thing only when he is certain it has been earned, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson smiled. The true measure of power has never been volume. It has never been the size of the weapon, or the loudness of the declaration, or the number of people who witnessed the demonstration. The men who last, the men whose names echo down through decades in the places that remember such things, are the men who understand that every situation contains, if you are patient enough to find it, a single, decisive move. One move, made at the right moment, aimed at the right point, with the right intention behind it. Not the most violent move, not the most dramatic. The right one. And when the game ends, the one who loses never quite knows when it was over. They replay the moves in their mind, searching for the error, the turning point, the place where things went wrong. But the truth is simpler and more humbling than any single mistake. The truth is that the game was already decided before the first piece was touched. It was decided in the quality of attention each player brought to the board. It was decided in who was willing to wait, to see, to understand what the other man could not. The king of Harlem turned back to his board. The pieces stood exactly where he had placed them. The game was finished. The city below continued its ordinary, extraordinary life, and in a train car somewhere in New Jersey, heading west toward a city that would not ask too many questions. A very large man sat very quietly and stared at his own hands and understood. With the permanent comprehension that only certain experiences can produce, that he had never once been the most powerful thing in the room,